Hi everyone, Julie Anderson here with Your Best Mind. I recently did a video called Why Don't They Listen? It was all about explaining the concept behind the brain-personality connection when it comes to different ways of communicating and how different people have different preferences. And those three preferences that I listed were the auditories, the visuals, and the kinesthetics. So I thought I'd do some continuation videos and just discuss those in a little bit more detail. I'm going to do 3 videos, one that deals with each of those 3 preferences, each of those 3 communication styles, and just give you a little bit of personality traits or things that you might see or hear or feel coming from those 3 different styles, and explain a little bit more on why they do things the way that they do. So the first one that we're going to talk about is the auditories. Now, I'm not doing them in any particular order. I want to really emphasize, and I will repeat this on the other 2 videos. When I talk about the different communication styles, that's simply what I mean. They're just different. One is no better than the other. One is not a more superior way of communicating. They're just different, so please keep that in mind. The first one we're going to discuss is the auditories. Now, auditory communicators account for about 20% of the population, if you don't take gender into factor. If you factor in gender, well, then you've got more females than 20% that actually communicate through the auditory sense, or have that as their preference. Obviously, a little bit different between the male-female brain. That's a whole nother video on its own, right? So for the auditories, this means that they process information most efficiently and effectively based on what they hear, what they take in through their auditory sense. Doesn't mean that we don't use our other senses, it just means that that's the one that they prefer and that the brain registers the fastest. If they're walking into a room, it's the auditory input that's going to hit them first. So some of the things that you can see in a personality to understand that brain-personality connection that might give you some insight that the person you're talking to or that you yourself are an auditory are as follows. One is that they love to talk. Go figure, right? That's kind of a given. So they love to talk, and they might even enjoy talking to themselves because they just love to hear words. This also means that they love to read. Now, some people think that the reading is a visual communication style preference, but in actuality it's not. The portion of the brain that's used when you're reading really honestly has to do much more with the auditory than it does with the visual. So reading is an auditory sense. So if you know somebody or you personally are someone that just loves to read, it might mean that you're an auditory or they're an auditory. Now, another thing that you might be able to give you a tip off that they're an auditory communication preference is if they use words connected to hearing in their speech. So they might say phrases like, "Oh, that sounds good to me," or "I hear what you're saying." If you tend to use those types of phrases, or you know of somebody that uses those types of phrases, chances are they might be an auditory. Something else that's very, very particular, very specific about an auditory is that they're easily irritated by odd sounds. Sounds that the average person may not even notice, but for that 20% of the population, it can drive them up the wall. So sounds are very important. Squeaky chairs might really bother them. The sound of a dripping faucet. Things, just any little keys jangling in a pocket, keys or change in a pocket. You know, some people will, probably a kinesthetic, will be playing with those items in their pocket, and if there's an auditory standing next to them, it can be like, just right up the wall. I like to use an example of a good friend of mine and myself. She's very kinesthetic, and I'm very, very auditory. And we homeschooled our kids, and we used to go on field trips together and take our 5 boys, all within a 6-year range, in the car for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours to get to wherever the field trip was. Now, they would be sitting in the back just talking, and I would, at some point in time in the trip, I would inevitably have to turn around and say, "Okay, boys, keep it down a little bit." Whereas my friend, who's highly kinesthetic, oftentimes she would say to me, "Oh, were they being loud?" She didn't even really notice it, primarily because it wasn't something that bothered her because she wasn't an auditory. So if this is something that kind of sounds like you and describes you a little bit, you may be an auditory communicator. Now there are a lot of other things that can give you the tip off that someone is an auditory. But if any of those that I've mentioned hit or resonate with you, then you know how to handle it. You know that the best way to communicate with the auditory is through words. Tell them what you want. Tell them what you need. And most of the time they'll get it. Don't expect them to read between the lines. None of that. Don't sit something out for them to see. No, you gotta tell them. And if you tell them, more than likely they're gonna get it. So I hope this helps you to identify auditories in your life and hopefully just improve your communication with them a little bit. So watch for video number 2 when we'll be talking about the visual communicating styles. Until then, have a great day. This is Julie Anderson, again with Your Best Mind, where we use the latest in science and psychology to explain who we are, what we do, and why we do things the way that we do. What makes us tick? We also help you to discover your gold mine.